The air inside the boardroom on the 45th floor of the Sterling Tower was always cold, but today it felt arctic. Outside, the gray skyline of London was vanishing behind a wall of fog, but inside, the atmosphere was sharp enough to cut glass. 5 men sat around a table made of reclaimed black oak that cost more than most people's houses. They were the apex predators of the corporate world, men in Savile Row suits who spoke in acronyms and measured human value in quarterly percentage points. At the head of the table sat Julian Thorne. He was a man who wore his arrogance like a second skin. He checked his Swiss watch, an impatient tick that terrified his subordinates, and looked toward the door. "Where is this representative?" Julian sneered, tapping a gold pen against the table. "We have a merger to finalize it too. I don't have time for games." Just then, the heavy double doors creaked open. But it wasn't a team of high-priced lawyers that walked in. It wasn't a banker carrying a briefcase full of securities. It was a young woman. She looked like she had been blown into the building by a strong wind. She wore a faded denim jacket over a wool sweater that had seen better days, and her boots were scuffed at the toes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands escaping to frame a face that was pale, tired, but determined. She couldn't have been more than 22. The silence in the room was absolute. It lasted for 3 seconds, the time it took for the shock to register, before it was replaced by a sound that was far worse: laughter. It started with Julian, a low, mocking chuckle that quickly spread to the other 4 executives. They laughed not with joy, but with cruelty. To them, she looked like a lost intern, or perhaps the girl delivering their lunch order who had taken a wrong turn at the elevators. "Lost your way, darling?" Julian asked, leaning back, a smirk dancing on his lips. "The mailroom is in the basement. This is the executive suite. Security is usually better at keeping the riffraff out." The girl didn't flinch. She tightened her grip on a simple brown manila envelope she was holding against her chest. She walked forward, her boots squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor, until she stood directly opposite Julian. "I'm not lost," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "And I'm not here for the mail. I'm here to discuss the transition of ownership." The room erupted again. One of the junior executives actually slapped the table, tears of mirth gathering in his eyes. "Ownership?" Julian wiped his eye, shaking his head. "Kid, you've got guts, I'll give you that. But this isn't a fairy tale and you aren't Cinderella. This is a multi-billion-pound aerospace defense contractor. Now be a good girl and run along before I have security drag you out." He reached for his phone, dismissing her entirely. That was when she slid the envelope across the black oak table. It spun slowly, coming to a stop right under Julian's nose. "Read it," she said. 2 words. A command, not a request. Julian rolled his eyes, sighing theatrically for the benefit of his audience. He picked up the envelope, intending to toss it into the waste bin behind him, but as he pulled the thick, cream-colored legal paper out, his eyes caught the letterhead, and then they dropped to the bottom of the page, the signature. It was bold, erratic, and written in a very specific, rare fountain pen ink, imperial purple. It was a signature Julian had feared and revered for 20 years. The blood drained from Julian's face so fast it looked like he might faint. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The laughter in the room died instantly, choked off by the look of sheer terror on their leader's face. What kind of name, what kind of power could turn a room full of wolves into sheep in a single second? In that frozen moment, a decade of greed collided with a single, forgotten winter night. It's a story that reminds us all how one small act can rewrite destinies. Stick around, because you won't believe how it unfolds. The twist in this document isn't just about money, it's about a test of character that everyone in this room failed, except one. If you're moved by tales of everyday heroes and the magic of kindness, hit that subscribe button right now for more stories on kindness lights. Like this video if it touches your heart, and drop a comment below sharing your own act of kindness. Let's build a community that shines bright now. Let's dive into the story. It all started 12 years ago, in the rugged, unforgiving hills of the Peak District in northern England. Back then, Julian Thorne was already a shark, but a smaller one. He was a director of operations at Sterling Dynamics, the crown jewel of British engineering. The company was owned by Silas Sterling. Silas was a legend. He was an eccentric genius who had patented engine parts used in everything from deep-sea submarines to Mars rovers. But Silas was also a recluse. He had no wife, no children, and no patience for the corporate politics that Julian loved so much. Silas cared about machines, and he cared about integrity. He was known to fire executives for lying about expenses, and he drove the same car he had restored in his 20s, a vintage 1965 Aston Martin. Age, however, was a battle Silas couldn't engineer his way out of. He was 81, his joints ached, and his heart was growing weaker. It was Christmas Eve, and the weather reports had warned of a once-in-a-generation blizzard. Most people stayed indoors, huddled by fires. But Silas Sterling was stubborn. He wanted to drive from the company factory to his remote estate in the hills. He dismissed his chauffeur, wanting the solitude of the drive to think about the future of his company. He was worried. He saw men like Julian circling like vultures, waiting for him to die so they could strip the company for parts and sell it to the highest bidder. "I can handle a bit of snow," Silas had grumbled, pulling on his driving gloves. He was wrong. An hour into the drive, the bit of snow turned into a whiteout. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the heavy vintage car. The temperature plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. The roads became sheets of black ice hidden under drifts of snow. Silas navigated a sharp bend, his old eyes straining against the darkness. Suddenly, the engine of the Aston Martin sputtered. A belt snapped, a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot, and the power steering died. The car slid uncontrollably, spinning 180 degrees before slamming rear first into a snowbank in a ditch. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas tried the ignition. Click, click, click. Dead. He tried to open the door, but the snow was piled high against it. He managed to push it open a crack, but the biting wind instantly seared his skin. He was trapped. He was miles from the nearest town, on a road nobody used on Christmas Eve. He had no cell signal in the valley. For the first time in his life, the billionaire was truly powerless. His money couldn't buy warmth. His reputation couldn't negotiate with the frost. He sat there for an hour, shivering violently. His breath came in shallow clouds. Hypothermia was setting in. He felt sleepy, a dangerous, fatal sleepiness. He watched the headlights of a few trucks pass on the upper ridge, miles away, oblivious to the dying man in the ditch below. "So this is it," Silas whispered to the dashboard. "Alone." And then, a pair of headlights washed over the snow. It wasn't a rescue vehicle. It was a battered, rusty pizza delivery scooter, modified with a sidecar for deliveries. It looked ridiculous in the storm, skidding and sliding, fighting the wind. The rider saw the glimmer of the Aston Martin's chrome bumper in the ditch. Most people would have kept driving, terrified of stopping in such weather. But the scooter slowed down. It wobbled, corrected, and pulled over. A figure hopped off. It was a girl, bundled in layers of mismatched clothes, wearing a helmet that was too big for her. This was Clara. At 18, Clara was working 3 jobs. Her father, a former mechanic, had passed away the year before, leaving behind nothing but debts and a garage full of tools. Clara had dropped out of engineering school to pay her mother's medical bills. She was delivering pizzas in a blizzard for tips that wouldn't even cover the cost of her fuel. She scrambled down the embankment, sliding in the snow until she reached the car. She yanked the door open. Sir, are you awake?" she shouted over the wind. Silas looked up, his eyes glassy. "Cold," he mumbled. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't ask if he had insurance. She didn't ask who he was. She unzipped her oversized thermal delivery bag, the one meant to keep pizzas hot, and pulled out the insulated heat pads. "Hold these," she ordered, shoving the warm pads against his chest and hands. Then she took off her own heavy scarf and wrapped it around his neck. "My scooter won't carry both of us up this hill in this ice," she assessed quickly, looking at the incline. "And we can't stay here. I need to get your engine running just enough to get the heater on, or you'll freeze before an ambulance gets here." "It's the belt," Silas chattered. "Alternator belt." Snapped. Clara nodded. She knew cars. She had grown up under the hood of cars with her dad. She ran back to her scooter and rummaged in her toolkit. She came back not with a spare belt, but with a pair of thick pantyhose she had bought for her mother and a roll of industrial tape. "Pop the hood!" she yelled. For 20 minutes in the freezing dark, Clara worked. Her fingers were numb, raw, and bleeding from the cold metal, but she didn't stop. She improvised a temporary belt using the nylon and tape, an old mechanic's trick her dad had taught her. It was a 1 in a million shot. She slammed the hood. "Try it now! Give it gas!" Silas turned the key. The engine wheezed, whined, and then, miraculously, roared to life. The heater sputtered on. Clara slumped against the car, exhausted. She guided Silas, driving slowly behind his car on her scooter, all the way to the nearest service station, ensuring he made it to safety. Under the bright fluorescent lights of the gas station, Silas finally saw her clearly. She was shivering, her face smeared with grease, looking exhausted. "You saved my life," Silas said, his voice trembling as he warmed his hands on a coffee cup. I am Silas Sterling. I want to write you a check. Name your price. 10,000? 50,000? He reached for his checkbook with shaking hands. Clara stopped him. She smiled, a tired but genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "I know who you are, Mr. Sterling. We studied your engine designs in my first semester," she said quietly. "But I don't want your money." "Don't be foolish, girl," Silas barked, his old gruffness returning. "Everyone wants money. Why did you stop? Why did you ruin your hands fixing my car?" Clara looked down at her grease-stained knuckles. "Because my dad used to say that machines are easy to fix, but people are fragile. If you see someone broken down, you stop. Because one day it might be you in the ditch." She zipped up her jacket. "Just build things that last, Mr. Sterling. That's all the payment I need. And maybe tip your next delivery driver a bit better." She hopped on her scooter and buzzed away into the night, leaving a billionaire standing stunned in a gas station parking lot, holding a blank check that was worthless against the weight of her integrity. 12 years passed. The world changed. Silas Sterling grew older, frailer, and more reclusive. He retreated into his estate, rarely seen in public. Meanwhile, at Sterling Dynamics, Julian Thorne rose to power. With Silas absent, Julian became the acting CEO. He was the antithesis of everything Silas and Clara stood for. Julian cut the R&D budget by 40% to boost short-term stock prices. He laid off 3,000 factory workers just weeks before Christmas to trigger executive bonuses. He stopped the internship programs for underprivileged youth. The soul of the company rotted from the inside out. The machines they built became cheaper, less reliable, designed with planned obsolescence to force customers to buy new models sooner. Silas watched all of this from his isolation. He had spies in the company. He knew the rot that Julian was spreading. But Silas was also busy. He hadn't forgotten the girl in the snow. He hired private investigators not to spy on her, but to watch over her. He learned that Clara had never gone back to engineering school. She couldn't afford it. She was working as a shift manager at a logistics warehouse, still fixing cars on weekends for neighbors who couldn't afford mechanics. She was still struggling, still giving, still poor. Silas realized something profound in his final months. He had built an empire of steel and silicon, but he had no heir of flesh and blood who shared his heart. Julian had the skills, but lacked the soul. Clara had the soul, but lacked the opportunity. So, Silas picked up his imperial purple fountain pen one last time. He wrote a new will. He sealed it with wax, locked it in his vault, and gave instructions that it was only to be opened upon his death, in the presence of the current board of directors. Last week, Silas Sterling died in his sleep. The funeral was a lavish affair, attended by politicians and rivals. Julian Thorne gave a eulogy that was perfectly delivered and entirely fake, speaking of loss while mentally calculating the size of his new corner office. Which brings us back to the boardroom. The laughter had completely vanished. The only sound was the hum of the hard drive in the server room down the hall. Julian stared at the document. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. This is a forgery," Julian stammered, his voice an octave higher than usual. Silas would never. You? A warehouse worker? A nobody? Clara leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the table. Read the addendum, Julian. Out loud. Julian swallowed hard. He looked at the paragraph highlighted in red. He didn't want to read it, but the lawyers flanking the room, who had entered silently behind Clara, nodded sternly. I, Silas Sterling, Julian read, his voice cracking, leave 51% of the voting stock and the position of chairperson of Sterling Dynamics to Clara Mitchell. Not because she is a business tycoon, but because on the coldest night of my life, she was the only human being who saw a person, not a paycheck. Julian stopped. He looked up, his eyes wide. Keep reading, Clara commanded softly. To Julian Thorne, Julian continued, sweating now, I leave my vintage 1965 Aston Martin. It is currently in the garage, broken down. The alternator belt is missing. If you can fix it yourself with your own hands in the snow, without calling for help, you may keep your seat on the board. If not, your resignation is effective immediately. The silence in the room was heavy, almost suffocating. One of the other executives, a man who had laughed the loudest earlier, looked from Julian to Clara. He saw the quiet strength in her posture. He realized the game was over. He slowly closed his notebook, stood up, and extended a hand to Clara. Miss Mitchell, he said respectfully, where should we begin? Julian dropped the paper. He knew he couldn't change a tire, let alone fix an alternator belt. He had spent his life manipulating numbers, not building things. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the room, the door slamming shut on his career. Clara didn't sit in the head chair immediately. She walked to the window and looked out at the London fog. We are going to make changes, she said, turning to face the remaining men. We are rehiring the factory workers Julian fired, we are refunding the internship program, and we are going back to building machines that don't break. We're going to build a company that helps people out of ditches, not one that drives past them. Julian Thorne tried to start his own consulting firm, but word spread. In the end, it wasn't his lack of skill that ruined him. It was his reputation for heartlessness. Under Clara's leadership, Sterling Dynamics didn't just survive, it evolved. It didn't happen overnight. There were hard days. The stock dipped initially when she prioritized employees over quick profits. But slowly, the quality of their engineering became legendary again. The loyalty of her staff was unbreakable. They knew their CEO was someone who knew what it was like to be cold, hungry, and ignored. Clara proved that empathy isn't a weakness in business. It's the ultimate competitive advantage. It's a powerful lesson for all of us. You never know who you are talking to. The tired waitress, the quiet janitor, the person struggling with a flat tire in the rain or a broken engine in the snow, they are the protagonists of their own stories. And sometimes, just sometimes, they hold the keys to the kingdom. Silas Sterling left a final note in that envelope, just for Clara. It read, You fixed my engine that night, but you really fixed my heart. Drive carefully. What do you think? Would you have stopped in that blizzard, or would you have driven past? Be honest in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that good people still win in the end. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Remember, kindness is a currency that never devalues. Invest it wisely. See you in the next video.